Hello. In this brief lecture, we are going to clear up a little bit of terminology and also lay the lines for some of our future discussions about political stability and instability. And to do so, we're going to talk about the distinction between states and nations and what those two things mean and how they're actually quite different and what the modern nation state is. All right, so to begin with, we're going to return to the state. Remember that territorial unit that is sovereign. And just to clear up any confusion, when we talk about the state in political science terms, we're really talking about what in everyday conversations people would typically call a country, right? And so when I say state in political science, it's really complicated, especially given where we live. If we lived in a lot of the world, it wouldn't be so complicated, but we happen to live in a state called the United States, right? Of course, comprised of 50 states. And so it's tricky. So the state of Colorado or the state of Virginia or Ohio, right? These are in our everyday language states, but in political science, we wouldn't necessarily call them a state. They would be a subnational unit. They're smaller, right? And so when we're talking about the state today, we're talking about over here where we see the sovereign states that are part of the United Nations. And that's what we're going to mean. So again, the state, this sovereign political unit with the ultimate authority over a given territory. So states and nations differ. A nation, as opposed to a nation is not a territorial unit. It is actually about a group of people with some shared similarities, some sort of cultural connection. So Shively's definition is that a nation is a large group of people who are bound together and recognize a similarity among themselves because of a common culture, right? And so a nation is something that is tied together, usually by common cultural things like religion or ethnicity, or especially language. Language matters a whole lot when we're sort of delineating how people seem to group themselves. But this is about people grouping themselves, right? They recognize a similarity among themselves, and so again, we're getting to this sort of more subjective view. So here we have a map of the spread of Kurdish people. And the Kurds are a nation, right? But they are a nation without a state. You can see that there are a lot of Kurds, even majority Kurds here at the Iraq-Iran border. There's lots of Kurds within Turkey, within Syria. And this is a nation of people. They share a language, they share a history, they share a lot. And they see themselves as distinct from the others. However, they do not have political representation with their own state. And indeed, this is the distinction between a state and a nation. A state is a political organization, right? It has that ultimate authority, that sovereignty over a given territory. Well, a nation is a cultural unit. It doesn't necessarily have any political representation. Often nations do have political representation, but we can certainly find lots of examples like those of the nation of the Kurdish people who do not have their own political representation in the form of a modern state. And so there are lots of ways that the different lines between states and nations can cause issues. And one of those ways is that lots of states include many nations. Now, of course, our own state, the United States of America, includes several nations. We have several sovereign indigenous nations, right? And we are certainly comprised of people from nations from all over the world. There are lots of different cultures. This is the idea of a melting pot. And that is actually very much baked into the basic fabric of the United States. However, it's not always the case. And we can look at Russia, right? Here is the Caucasian region in Russia. So, down here is Iran and Turkey. And we see Russia is comprised of lots of different people who see themselves as similar, who share a common perception of their shared fate, who share a culture. And this has caused a lot of conflict in places like Chechnya, right? Where people want their own political representation, but the state, the Russian government, does not want to allow them that. Of course, here is Libya, and we can see that Libya is comprised of different groups as well, of different nations. And recently, in the last few years, After the Arab Spring or the Arab Uprising, after Gaddafi, the former dictator, fell, there was widespread fighting between these various groups. And indeed, a lot of the time we will see violence break out where there are lots of different nations within one political organization, as these nations who see themselves as different from one another fight for their own political independence or for control over that sovereignty, over the power to make the authoritative binding decisions that govern their lives. Of course, today, there's the ideal of a nation state. And the nation state is simply the idea of a coinciding political and cultural boundaries. That is the idea that for every nation, this cultural group of people who share something, they get their own political representation. And this was really enshrined in international norms and laws after the First World War. And so here you can see a map of Central Europe, and you can see what was once the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? And so this was a very multicultural, multinational single state, right? Not only did it have Austria and Hungary under one political sovereign state, but it also had the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Croats, a lot of Serbs, Bosnians, etc., etc., etc. Well, this was seen as a very large generator of conflict. And so after World War I, when they were redrawing lines, a lot of policymakers really tried to get as many nations to have their own states. And so, Austro-Hungarian Empire becomes several smaller states that are meant to represent each. So the idea is giving cultural groups their own political representation. This is often a way that can create unity within the political unit of the state, right? If you have a state with several nations, the people in those different nations may be fighting with other nations. The idea here is that you can have great unity for general support for any national causes based upon nationalism. Shively actually calls this disturbing, because I think what he's sort of saying is that the ability of leaders to mobilize based on nationalism might help them get away with things they shouldn't be getting away with, might help them stoke conflict when there shouldn't be conflict. And so I'll leave that to you to sort of think about. What I will leave you with is simply the observation that this is difficult. Giving each nation its own political organization in form of a modern state is tricky, and you see this with this example. So I used to live in Hungary. I lived about right here, and people are still really angry 100 years after, or almost 100 years after this treaty was decided that divided Hungary up. There are people who are still angry because lots of Hungarians live here, lots of Hungarians live here, lots of Hungarians live here, right? And so because people are sort of marbled together, right? You have Hungarians living next to Romanians, living next to Serbs, living next to Croats. They are very much marbled together. You can't really just make a nice, clean incision and separate everybody out so that every nation has its own political representation in the form of the state. And so building nation states can create its own conflict as well. But the central theme I'd like you to take away from this short lecture is just the idea that nations and states are different, and where those different boundaries fail to coincide perfectly in the form of this ideal nation state, we can see really big issues with political conflict. Thanks for joining me. Have a wonderful day.